A classroom divided. Maggie Adams adjusted her blazer as she stepped into her sixth-grade classroom, her sharp heels clicking on the tiled floor. The room was bustling with preteen energy. Laughter, whispers, and the occasional scrape of a chair against the floor. Maggie cleared her throat, a subtle but firm sound that immediately silenced the chatter. For 25 years, she had perfected the art of commanding attention, and her reputation as a strict but effective teacher preceded her. "Settle down, class," she announced, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. She walked to the whiteboard, her movements precise, as if choreographed. "We had a lot to get through today, and I won't tolerate distractions. Open your textbooks to Chapter 7. The students scrambled to comply, their faces a mixture of nervousness and respect. All except one. At the back of the room, Daniel, a quiet, wheelchair-bound boy with soft brown eyes and a tentative smile, struggled to retrieve his book from his bag. His fingers fumbled with the zipper, and the sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Maggie's eyes snapped to him, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, "if you can't keep up, you'll have to stay after class. I won't have one student slowing down the rest." The room went still. The other students exchanged uneasy glances, their gazes darting between Daniel and their teacher. Daniel's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, and he ducked his head, focusing intently on his bag. His best friend, Mia, sitting 2 desks away, opened her mouth to say something but quickly shut it when Maggie shot her a warning glance. As Daniel finally pulled out his textbook, his hands trembling, Maggie turned back to the board. "Fractions," she began, her marker squeaking across the surface. "The backbone of mathematics. If you don't understand these, you'll struggle for the rest of your academic career." She launched into the lesson with her usual efficiency, but her eyes kept drifting back to Daniel. His wheelchair seemed to occupy more space than it should, a constant reminder of the accommodations she had to make. The ramps, the extra time during tests, the individualized attention. It was exhausting, and though she hated to admit it, a small part of her resented him for it. The class ended without incident, but Maggie couldn't shake her irritation. As the students filed out for recess, Daniel lingered behind, his wheelchair catching on the edge of a desk. Maggie sighed audibly, tapping her foot as she waited. "Do you need help?" she asked, her tone exasperated. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes wide and earnest. "No, thank you, Miss Adams. I've got it." He maneuvered his chair with deliberate care, finally clearing the desk and heading toward the door. Maggie watched him go, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't dislike Daniel, not really. But she couldn't deny that his presence made her job harder. Out on the playground, Daniel joined his friends near the basketball court. Despite his limitations, he had a knack for staying involved. He acted as the designated passer, using his strong arms to send the ball sailing to his teammates. His laughter rang out across the yard, a rare sound that made Mia smile. "Nice one, Daniel," she called, catching the ball and dribbling it toward the hoop. Daniel grinned, his confidence growing with each successful pass. For a brief moment, he forgot about the challenges he faced. Here, among his friends, he wasn't the boy in the wheelchair. He was just Daniel. Inside the staff room, Maggie sipped her coffee, her mood sour. Another teacher, Mrs. Green, sat across from her, grading papers. "Rough day?" Mrs. Green asked, glancing up. Maggie sighed, setting her mug down. "It's always rough. These kids expect everything handed to them. And some of them," she trailed off, her expression hardening, "some of them require more attention than the rest. It's unfair to the others." Mrs. Green frowned. "You mean Daniel?" Maggie didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Mrs. Green sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Maggie, you've been teaching for a long time. You know as well as I do that every student deserves a chance. And what about the other 20 students in my class?" Maggie countered, her voice rising. Do they deserve to have their progress stunted because of one child? Mrs. Green hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Maggie stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Time to get back to it," she said, her tone brisk. "Some of us have a classroom to manage." The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons and worksheets. By the time the final bell rang, Maggie was exhausted. As the students packed up their bags, she called out, "Daniel, stay behind for a moment." The boy froze, his hands hovering over the wheels of his chair. His classmates hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but Maggie waved them off. "The rest of you go, Daniel, and I need to talk." Once the room was empty, Maggie closed the door and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of frustration and something else. Pity, perhaps. "Daniel," she began, her voice unusually soft. "I need to know if you're truly giving your best effort. You're falling behind, and it's affecting the entire class." Daniel stared at her, his eyes brimming with unused tears. "I am trying, Miss Adams. I really am." Maggie sighed, running a hand through her tightly pinned hair. "I know this isn't easy for you, but life isn't easy, Daniel. And the sooner you learn that, the better." Her word hung heavy in the air, a bitter truth that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his lap. "I'll try harder," he whispered. Maggie nodded, her expression softening slightly. "That's all I ask." As Daniel wheeled himself out of the room, Maggie sank into her chair, suddenly feeling very old. She had meant to inspire him, to push him toward success. But the look in his eyes, hurt, defeated, told her she had failed. What she didn't know was that the conversation they'd just had would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. The whisper of defiance. The next morning, the air in the classroom felt different. It wasn't something overt, just a subtle tension that seemed to hang over the students like an invisible fog. Maggie Adams noticed it immediately, but brushed it off as typical midweek sluggishness. She glanced at the clock and clapped her hands to get the room's attention. "All right, class, let's settle down," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a weariness that even she couldn't shake. "Today, we're continuing our work on fractions." The students straightened in their seats, pulling out notebooks and pencils. Maggie's eyes scanned the room and landed on Daniel, who was already in position. His textbook open and his hands folded neatly on the desk. There was a quiet determination in his posture, as if he were preparing for a battle only he understood. Maggie felt a pang of something. Was it guilt? She dismissed it quickly. The boy needed to learn discipline, and she was there to teach him. Still, something about the way his classmates kept glancing at him, their faces shadowed with worry, made her stomach churn. "Before we dive into the lesson," Maggie began, turning to the board, "I want to address something. Yesterday I noticed a lack of focus from some of you." She paused, letting the statement sink in. Her gaze swept the room, but her eyes lingered on Daniel. "That's not going to happen today. Understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the class. Daniel nodded as well, his face expressionless. Maggie turned back to the board and began writing equations, her marker squeaking loudly in the silence. As the lesson progressed, Daniel's focus didn't waver. He answered questions when called upon, his voice steady and confident. His classmates seemed to rally around him, offering quiet support in the form of smiles and encouraging glances. Maggie noticed, but instead of being impressed, she felt irritated. It was as if they were challenging her authority in some unspoken way. When the bell rang for recess, the students filed out of the classroom with their usual energy, but Daniel lingered. Maggie raised an eyebrow as he approached her desk, wheeling himself forward with deliberate slowness. "Miss Adams," he said quietly. "Yes, Daniel," she replied. Her tone clipped. "I wanted to say thank you for pushing me to try harder," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a hint of hesitation. "I know I can do better, and I will." Maggie blinked, caught off guard by his words. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Then she nodded curtly. Good. That's what I like to hear. Daniel nodded and wheeled himself toward the door. But just as he was about to leave, he paused and turned back to her. And Miss Adams, he added, his voice soft but firm. I'm not holding anyone back. I'm just doing my best, like everyone else. With that, he left the room, leaving Maggie staring after him, her chest tightening in a way she couldn't quite explain. Outside, the playground buzzed with activity. Daniel joined his friends near the basketball court, his spirits visibly higher than they'd been the day before. Mia and a few others had come up with a new game that allowed Daniel to participate more actively, and he dove in with enthusiasm. His laughter rang out across the yard, drawing smiles from those nearby. But not everyone was pleased. Near the edge of the playground, a small group of students whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward Daniel. Their leader, a tall boy named Travis, crossed his arms and smirked. "Look at him," Travis said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Thinks he's so special just because he's in a wheelchair." Mia whirled around, her eyes blazing. "Shut up, Travis. At least Daniel tries, which is more than I can say for you." Travis shrugged, unfazed. "Whatever. It's not like he can actually keep up with the rest of us." Daniel heard the exchange but said nothing. Instead, he focused on the game, determined not to let Travis's words get under his skin. But inside, a familiar knot of insecurity began to form. Back in the classroom, Maggie was grading papers when Mrs. Green walked in, carrying a stack of folders. She placed them on Maggie's desk and lingered, her expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Maggie asked without looking up. Mrs. Green hesitated before speaking. "It's about Daniel." Maggie set her pen down and sighed. "What about him?" "I think you're being too hard on him," Mrs. Green said, her tone gentle but firm. "He's a good kid, Maggie. He tries harder than most of the other students, and he doesn't complain." Maggie frowned. "It's not about effort, Carol. It's about results. I can't let one student derail the progress of the entire class." "But he's not derailing anything," Mrs. Green countered. "If anything, he's inspiring the other students. Have you noticed how they rally around him? They see his strength, even if you don't." Maggie opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. The students began filing back into the classroom, their chatter filling the air. Mrs. Green gave Maggie a meaningful look before leaving. The afternoon lesson was uneventful, but the tension in the room remained. Maggie found herself watching Daniel more closely, noting the way his classmates interacted with him. They weren't just tolerating him. They respected him. And for the first time, Maggie wondered if she had been too harsh, not just with him but with all her students. As the day drew to a close, Maggie dismissed the class and began tidying up her desk. She was reaching for her bag when Principal Wilson appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. "Miss Adams," he said, his tone neutral. "Can I have a word?" Maggie nodded, her stomach sinking. She followed him to his office, her mind racing. What could this be about? Had a parent complained? Or worse, had one of the students? When they reached the office, Wilson gestured for her to sit. He took a seat across from her, folding his hands on the desk. "I've received some concerning feedback about your classroom management," he began, "specifically regarding your treatment of Daniel." Maggie's face flushed. "With all due respect, Principal Wilson, I've been teaching for over 2 decades. I know how to manage my classroom." "I'm not questioning your experience, Maggie," Wilson said calmly. "But I am questioning your approach. Several students have come forward, expressing concern about how Daniel is being treated. And frankly, I've observed it myself." Maggie's heart sank. She opened her mouth to defend herself but stopped when Wilson held up a hand. "I'm not here to reprimand you," he said, "but I do think it's time for you to reflect on your methods. These kids look up to you, Maggie. They deserve better." Maggie left the office feeling both angry and ashamed. She had always prided herself on being a good teacher, someone who pushed her students to succeed. But now, for the first time, she was forced to confront the possibility that she had been pushing too hard. As she walked down the empty hallway, the sound of her heels echoing around her, Maggie couldn't shake Daniel's words from earlier that day. "I'm not holding anyone back. I'm just doing my best, like everyone else." For the first time in years, Maggie Adams began to wonder if her best had been enough. A catalyst for change. Maggie lingered in the hallway, her thoughts tangled in a web of doubt and defensiveness. The quiet hum of distant chatter and shuffling papers from classrooms down the corridor felt like a distant echo compared to the storm brewing in her mind. For years, she had relied on structure, discipline, and unwavering control. That had always been her way, but now, for the first time, the cracks in her approach were glaringly obvious. As she returned to her classroom to gather her belongings, the memories of the day played on repeat. Daniel's quiet defiance, Mrs. Green's gentle reprimand, and Principal Wilson's words of caution were like puzzle pieces, each one nudging her closer to an uncomfortable truth. She stopped mid-step and glanced at the row of desks, imagining Daniel's spot near the back. His struggles, both physical and emotional, played out daily in full view of the class. The other students weren't blind to it. They were learning from it, one way or another. The question was, what lesson was she teaching them? Later that evening, Maggie sat at her dining table, her lesson plans spread out before her. She stared at them, but the words blurred together. Instead, her mind wandered to Daniel. She recalled his trembling hands as he reached for his textbook, the way his classmates shielded him with their presence, and the quiet determination in his eyes when he had thanked her. "I'm not holding anyone back." Those words echoed in her head like a mantra. She had dismissed them in the moment, but now she couldn't stop replaying them. Maggie sighed and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She thought back to why she had become a teacher in the first place: to inspire, to nurture, to help children find their potential. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of that. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was an email notification from Principal Wilson. The subject line read, "Professional Development Resources, Inclusive Teaching Strategies." Maggie hesitated before opening it. The email contained links to articles, workshops, and videos, all aimed at supporting students with diverse needs. The principal's words at the end of the email were simple but impactful: "For the benefit of all students." Maggie's first instinct was to feel defensive. After all, wasn't she already doing her best? But as she clicked on one of the links and began reading, something shifted. The article detailed strategies for fostering an inclusive classroom environment, emphasizing the importance of empathy, patience, and collaboration. As Maggie read, she felt a knot in her chest. These weren't just abstract ideas. They were the principles she had once believed in. The next day, Maggie entered the classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The students trickled in, chatting and laughing as they took their seats. Maggie's eyes found Daniel almost immediately. He was wheeling himself into position, his movements deliberate and careful. Mia greeted him with a bright smile, and he returned it, though his expression held a trace of uncertainty. "Good morning, everyone," Maggie began, her voice softer than usual. The class quieted, sensing the shift in her tone. "Before we start today's lesson, I want to say something." The students exchanged curious glances, their attention now fully on her. Maggie took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the room. "I've been reflecting on how I approach teaching," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And I realize that I haven't always been fair. Sometimes I've been too focused on moving forward and not enough on making sure everyone feels valued and supported." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, and he sat up straighter in his chair. Maggie's heart raced, but she pressed on. "That's going to change," she said firmly, "because every single one of you matters. And together, we're going to create a classroom where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, at their own pace." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Mia began to clap. One by one, the other students joined in until the applause filled the room. Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat, but she forced a smile and gestured for them to quiet down. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's get started." The lesson that day was different. Maggie found herself pausing more often, asking questions and engaging with the students in a way she hadn't in years. When Daniel struggled with an equation, she didn't rush him or dismiss him. Instead, she knelt beside his desk and guided him through it step by step. "You're doing great," she said, her voice warm. "Take your time." Daniel's face lit up with a shy smile, and for the first time, Maggie felt a sense of pride, not in her teaching, but in him. At recess, Maggie watched from the window as the students played. Daniel was at the center of the group, his laughter ringing out as he passed the basketball to Mia. Travis, the boy who had taunted him the day before, stood on the sidelines, looking sheepish. Maggie made a mental note to speak with him later about kindness and respect. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt hope. She wasn't perfect, and she still had a lot to learn. But she was willing to try, for Daniel, and for every other student in her care, because teaching wasn't just about fractions or lesson plans, it was about building a community where every child could thrive. As the day ended and the students filed out, Daniel paused at her desk. He looked up at her, his eyes bright. "Thank you, Miss Adams," he said softly. Maggie smiled, her chest tightening. "No, Daniel. Thank you." The boy wheeled himself out of the room, and Maggie watched him go, her heart full for the first time in years. The journey wasn't over, but she knew she was on the right path. And this time, she wouldn't walk it alone. A ripple of courage. The following week, the classroom buzzed with a strange energy. It wasn't the usual mid-morning chatter, but a quiet anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. Maggie Adams could feel it the moment she stepped into the room. The students sat straighter, their eyes brighter, and Daniel, who usually kept to himself, seemed to radiate a newfound confidence. Maggie had spent the past few days reflecting on her teaching methods and making deliberate changes to her approach. She had started integrating group activities, pairing students in ways that encouraged collaboration. But what surprised her most was the ripple effect her shift in attitude was having on the entire class. That morning, Maggie began with a group project on fractions. She divided the students into teams, ensuring each group had a mix of strengths. To her surprise, the students eagerly embraced the task. Even Travis, who often exuded an air of disinterest, seemed invested. Maggie walked around the room, observing their interactions. Daniel's group was huddled together, deep in discussion. He was explaining a problem to Mia and another boy, Jacob, who looked at him with a mixture of admiration and respect. Daniel's voice was steady, his hands moving animatedly as he pointed to the worksheet. "See," he said, "if you divide the numerator by the denominator, you get the fraction in simplest form." Maggie paused near his desk, listening. She had never heard Daniel speak with such authority before. It wasn't just his confidence that struck her. It was the way the other students listened to him, truly listened. They weren't just indulging him out of pity. They genuinely valued his input. When the groups presented their solutions, Daniel volunteered to speak for his team. Maggie watched as he wheeled himself to the front of the room, his hands gripping the sides of his chair with determination. "We solved the problems by breaking them into smaller parts," he explained, his voice clear and measured. "That way, we could focus on one step at a time." The class erupted into applause, and Daniel's cheeks flushed, but his smile was radiant. Maggie clapped along with them, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time, she saw Daniel not as a challenge or a burden, but as a student with immense potential, a potential she had almost crushed. During lunch, Maggie sat alone in the staff room, her thoughts swirling. She was startled when Mrs. Green joined her, placing a tray of food on the table. "I heard about your group project," Mrs. Green said, her tone warm. "The kids loved it, especially Daniel." Maggie smiled faintly. He's really blossomed, hasn't he? Mrs. Green nodded. You gave him the space to do that. It's amazing what a little encouragement can do. Maggie looked down at her coffee, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. I can't stop thinking about how much I failed him before. We've all made mistakes, Maggie, Mrs. Green said gently. What matters is that you're trying to make it right now. Maggie nodded, her resolve strengthening. I want to do more than make it right. I want to create a classroom where every child feels like they belong. That afternoon, Maggie decided to address the class directly. As the students settled into their seats, she stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. Before we begin, she said, her voice steady, I want to talk to you all about something important. The students looked up at her, their faces curious. Maggie took a deep breath. I know I haven't always been the teacher you needed me to be, she began. I've been too focused on rules and results, and not enough on understanding each of you as individuals. But I want to change that. The room was silent, the students hanging on her every word. I want this classroom to be a place where everyone feels supported and valued, Maddie continued. And that means we need to support each other, not just in our schoolwork, but in everything we do. She looked around the room, her gaze resting briefly on each student. You all have so much potential, and I'm here to help you reach it. But I can't do it alone. I need your help to make this classroom a community. The students exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Then Maya raised her hand. We're already a community, she said, her voice strong. But it's up to all of us to make it better. Daniel nodded. We can start by looking out for each other. Like if someone's struggling, we help them instead of ignoring it. Maddie felt a lump rise in her throat. These children, these incredible, resilient children, were teaching her just as much as she was teaching them. Over the next few days, Maggie noticed small but significant changes in the classroom dynamic. The students were kinder to each other, more patient and understanding. When Daniel struggled to reach a book on the shelf, Travis, of all people, stepped forward to help him. Here, Travis said, handing Daniel the book. You need anything else? Daniel looked surprised but grateful. Thanks, Travis. I'm good. Maggie watched the exchange from her desk, her heart swelling with pride. The ripple of change was growing, and she knew it was only the beginning. One afternoon, as the students worked quietly on their assignments, Maggie's phone buzzed on her desk. She glanced at the screen and saw an email notification. It was from Principal Wilson. Maggie, it read, I've noticed a significant improvement in your classroom. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. The kids are thriving, and so are you. Let's talk soon about expanding these strategies to other classes. Maggie smiled, her chest filling with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. She set the phone down and looked out at her students. They were focused, engaged, and most importantly, happy. For the first time, Maggie felt like she was truly making a difference, not just for Daniel, but for every child in her care. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she was just getting started. The stand that changed everything. The weeks that followed were a period of transformation for Maggie Adams's classroom. The students were no longer just individuals filling desks. They had become a team, a family of sorts. Each child's strengths were celebrated, their weaknesses addressed with compassion rather than criticism. Maggie found herself looking forward to each day, her earlier frustrations replaced with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. But change, as Maggie was learning, often brought challenges. One chilly Tuesday morning, as the students shuffled into the classroom, Maggie noticed Daniel wheeling himself in with a slight frown. His usual smile was missing, and his movements seemed slower than usual. Mia hovered close by, her eyes darting nervously between Daniel and the other students. Everything all right, Daniel? Maggie asked, her tone light but concerned. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Maggie didn't press him, but she made a mental note to check in with him later. As the lesson began, She noticed whispers spreading through the room like wildfire. Students were glancing at Daniel, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Maggie's stomach tightened. Something was off. "All right, everyone," she said, clapping her hands to get their attention. "Focus up. Let's get started." The murmurs subsided, but the tension lingered. At lunch, Maggie decided to take a walk around the playground. She often did this now, using the time to observe the students in their natural element. She found Daniel sitting alone near the basketball court, his hands resting on his wheels. Mia and a few other friends stood nearby, their faces tight with worry. Maggie approached slowly, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Hey, Daniel," she said gently. "Mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Daniel shrugged but didn't look up. Maggie lowered herself onto the bench beside him, her eyes scanning the playground. "You want to tell me what's going on?" she asked after a moment. Daniel hesitated, then sighed. "It's just Travis and his friends. They've been saying things." "What kind of things?" Maggie pressed, her voice steady but firm. Daniel finally met her gaze, his brown eyes filled with frustration. "They keep saying I get special treatment because I'm in a wheelchair. Like I don't deserve to be here with everyone else." Maggie's chest tightened. She had worked so hard to create an inclusive environment, and the thought of any student feeling excluded, especially Daniel, made her blood boil. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "you belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Daniel nodded, but Maggie could tell the words didn't quite reach him. She looked over at Mia, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. "Mia," Maggie said, her tone thoughtful, "what do you think we should do about this?" Mia blinked, clearly surprised to be asked. I think we should talk about it. In class. So everyone understands." Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed. "You think that'll help?" Mia placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think if people really hear how you feel, they'll get it." Maggie felt a surge of pride. These kids, she thought, were braver than most adults she knew. That afternoon, Maggie stood at the front of the room, her hands resting on the edge of her desk. "Before we start today's lesson," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I want to talk about something important. It's come to my attention that some of you feel like things aren't fair in this classroom." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Travis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to Daniel. "I want to make something very clear," Maggie continued. "Fairness doesn't mean everyone gets the same thing. It means everyone gets what they need to succeed. And that looks different for each of you." She paused, letting her words sink in. Now Daniel has something he'd like to share. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but Mia gave him a reassuring nod. With a deep breath, Daniel wheeled himself to the front of the room. He turned to face his classmates, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "I know some of you think I get special treatment," he began, his voice steady but soft. "But the truth is, I have to work just as hard as everyone else, sometimes harder. And when Miss Adams or anyone else helps me, it's not because they think I'm less capable. It's because they want me to have the same chance to succeed as you." The room was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Daniel. He hesitated, then continued. "I didn't choose to be in this wheelchair, but I'm not going to let it stop me from doing my best. And I hope you won't let it stop you from seeing me as your classmate." When Daniel finished, the silence hung heavy in the air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Travis stood up. He cleared his throat, his face red. I didn't mean to make you feel bad," Travis mumbled. "I guess I just didn't think about it like that. I'm sorry." Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Travis." From that day on, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted again. The students became more aware of each other's struggles and more willing to step up when someone needed help. Maggie watched with pride as Daniel and Travis began to work together, their initial tension giving way to mutual respect. The change wasn't instant, nor was it perfect. There were still moments of frustration, Still days when Maggie had to remind her students, and herself, that growth took time. But the seeds of understanding had been planted, and Maggie was determined to nurture them. One evening, as Maggie sat at her desk grading papers, she received an unexpected email from Principal Wilson. It was a forwarded message from a parent, Daniel's mother. "Dear Principal Wilson, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Miss Adams for everything she's done for Daniel this year. He's come home every day with a smile on his face, and I've seen his confidence grow in ways I never thought possible. For the first time, he feels like he truly belongs. Please let her know how much we appreciate her." Maggie read the email twice, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She set her pen down and leaned back in her chair, a warmth spreading through her chest. She had doubted herself, made mistakes, and faced criticism. But in the end, she had chosen to listen, to learn, and to change. And that, she realized, was what teaching was all about. As she turned off the lights and left the classroom, Maggie felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. She was on the right path, not just as a teacher, but as a person. And she knew, without a doubt, that the best was yet to come. Rising above the shadows. The next day, the classroom buzzed with a sense of unity Maggie hadn't seen before. Daniel's heartfelt words and Travis's unexpected apology seemed to have ignited a new spirit of understanding among the students. They were still kids, prone to missteps and occasional teasing, but the air felt lighter. There was an unspoken agreement that they would try to be better, not perfect, but better. Maggie felt a renewed sense of purpose as she watched them collaborate on a group project that morning. The hum of quiet chatter and laughter filled the room as the students worked together, their ideas bouncing off one another like sparks. By lunchtime, the entire school seemed to be talking about the transformation in Maggie's class. Other teachers approached her in the staff room, their curiosity piqued. "What's your secret?" Mrs. Patel asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I heard about that moment with Daniel. It's incredible how your class has turned around." Maggie smiled, though she felt a twinge of embarrassment. "It's not a secret," she said. "It's just about listening to the kids and giving them a chance to shine." Mrs. Green, who had been quietly grading papers, looked up with a knowing smile. "Sounds like someone's found their teaching mojo again." Maggie chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just learning from them as much as they're learning from me." The staff room fell quiet for a moment as the other teachers reflected on her words. Maggie couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not for herself, but for her students. They were proving that even small changes could lead to big transformations. After lunch, the students filed back into the classroom, energized from their break. Maggie noticed Travis walking alongside Daniel, carrying his lunch tray for him. The sight warmed her heart, but she didn't comment. Sometimes, the most meaningful moments didn't need words. "All right, class," Maggie said, clapping her hands. "Let's dive into today's lesson." She introduced a new activity that required the students to pair up and solve math problems together. She deliberately mixed up the pairs, ensuring that each student had a chance to work with someone they didn't usually talk to. As the students got to work, Maggie wandered around the room, observing. She noticed Daniel and Travis working together, their heads bent over a shared worksheet. "Good teamwork," she said as she passed their desk. Both boys looked up and grinned. "Thanks, Miss Adams," Daniel said, his voice full of pride. The day seemed to fly by, and before Maggie knew it, the final bell rang. As the students packed up their bags, Daniel wheeled himself to her desk. "Miss Adams," he said hesitantly. "Yes, Daniel," Maggie replied, looking up from her papers. "Thanks for letting me talk to the class yesterday," he said, his cheeks slightly pink. "I was nervous, but it felt really good to say how I felt." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You were brave, Daniel. And because of you, this class is stronger. Never forget that." Daniel nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. "I won't." As he wheeled out of the room, Mia and a few other students waited for him at the door. They chatted animatedly as they headed down the hallway together, their laughter echoing behind them. Maggie watched them go, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had spent so many years focusing on rules and structure, believing that discipline was the key to success. But now she realized that connection, true human connection, was just as important, if not more so. Later that evening, Maggie sat at her dining table, reviewing lesson plans for the following week. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she picked it up to see a message from Principal Wilson. "Hi Maggie, just wanted to let you know that I've received more positive feedback from parents about your class. The changes you've made are making a real difference. Keep up the great work." Maggie set the phone down, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. She thought back to her conversation with Daniel earlier that day, his words still echoing in her mind. "I was nervous, but it felt really good to say how I felt." Maggie realized that Daniel wasn't the only one who had grown. She had changed too, in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had found her way back to the teacher she had once aspired to be, one who inspired, encouraged, and supported her students. And for the first time in years, Maggie Adams felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, a test of resolve. The changes in Maggie Adams's classroom had been noticed by everyone. Students, teachers, and even parents. Word had spread about how her students had grown more united, particularly the bond forming between Daniel and Travis, once rivals and now tentative allies. For Maggie, it was a source of pride, a testament to the power of listening and patience. But as with all transformations, there were challenges ahead. One crisp Thursday morning, Maggie arrived at school to find Principal Wilson waiting for her near the entrance. His expression was serious, and Maggie felt a flicker of concern. "Good morning, Maggie," he said, his tone measured. "Could I have a word with you before class?" "Of course," Maggie replied, falling into step beside him as they walked toward his office. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit. "I've been receiving wonderful feedback about your class," Wilson began, his voice warm. "The parents are thrilled, and the students seem to be thriving." Maggie smiled, relieved. "That's great to hear." Wilson's smile faded slightly. "However, not everyone is on board with the changes. I received a call from Travis's parents last night." Maggie's stomach sank. "What's the issue?" "They're concerned that the recent focus on inclusivity is taking time away from academics," Wilson explained. "They feel that Travis is being pressured to change, and that it's distracting him from his studies." Maggie's brow furrowed. "But Travis has been participating more than ever. He's engaged, contributing. He even apologized to Daniel." "I know," Wilson said quickly, "and I've seen the positive impact firsthand. But their perspective is different. They feel he's being forced into situations that make him uncomfortable." Maggie exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had worked so hard to create an environment where every student felt valued, and now it felt like her efforts were being questioned. "I'll talk to Travis's parents," Wilson said, his tone reassuring. "But I wanted you to be aware. You're doing great work, Maggie. Don't let this discourage you." Maggie nodded, though a knot of worry lingered in her chest. Back in the classroom, Maggie's mood was subdued, but she masked it well. The students filed in, chatting and laughing as they took their seats. Daniel greeted her with a cheerful "Good morning, Miss Adams," and she forced a smile in return. As the lesson began, Maggie found herself glancing at Travis more often than usual. He seemed his usual self, working diligently and occasionally cracking jokes with the boys around him. If he was feeling any discomfort, he didn't show it. During group activities, Maggie noticed something that made her pause. Travis, who had been paired with Daniel again, was not only participating but actively engaging. He leaned over the desk to show Daniel something in the textbook, his voice patient as he explained. "You see," Travis said, "if you flip the fraction, it makes division easier." Daniel nodded, his face lighting up with understanding. "Got it. Thanks, Travis." Maggie felt a swell of pride. Whatever reservations Travis's parents had, the boy himself seemed to be thriving. At recess, Maggie decided to approach Travis directly. She found him by the basketball court, shooting hoops with a few other boys. "Travis," she called, and he turned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" "Sure, Miss Adams," he said, jogging over to her. Maggie crouched slightly so they were at eye level. "How are you feeling about class lately? Do you think the group activities are helping?" Travis shrugged but smiled. "Yeah, I guess. It's cool working with Daniel. He's smart." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because I heard that you weren't so sure about that at first." Travis flushed, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, I was wrong. Daniel's cool. He's even better at fractions than me." Maggie smiled, her heart lifting. "I'm glad to hear that. Keep up the good work, okay?" Travis nodded and ran back to the court, leaving Maggie with a sense of renewed determination. She wouldn't let a few doubts overshadow the progress her students were making. Later that day, during a quiet moment, Daniel approached Maggie's desk. He hesitated before speaking, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. "Miss Adams," he said softly. "Yes, Daniel. Do you think people will always see me as different?" Maggie's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She leaned forward, her expression gentle. "I think people will see you as you show them who you are, and from what I see, you're strong, smart, and kind. Those are the things that matter." Daniel nodded, though his eyes remained uncertain. "Sometimes I wish I didn't have to prove it so much." Maggie reached out, placing a hand on his. "You don't have to prove anything, Daniel. You just have to be yourself. And if people can't see how amazing you are, that's their loss." Daniel smiled, his shoulders relaxing. "Thanks, Miss Adams." As the week progressed, Maggie found herself more determined than ever to defend the changes she had made. She began documenting the students' progress, taking note of how their engagement had increased and how their relationships were strengthening. She knew she might need this evidence if Travis's parents, or anyone else, challenged her again. On Friday afternoon, the school held an assembly to celebrate student achievements. Maggie's class sat together near the front, their faces glowing with excitement. As the principal handed out certificates, he paused at one in particular. "This next award," he announced, "is for a student who has shown incredible growth in both academics and character. He has demonstrated leadership, resilience, and kindness, inspiring his classmates along the way. Please join me in congratulating Daniel Johnson." The auditorium erupted into applause as Daniel wheeled himself to the stage. His classmates cheered, Mia and Travis among the loudest. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes as she watched him accept the certificate, his face radiant with pride. As Daniel returned to his seat, he looked at Maggie and mouthed, "Thank you." Maggie nodded, her chest swelling with emotion. She had doubted herself, faced criticism, and struggled with her own biases. But moments like this reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place. She wasn't just teaching fractions or grammar. She was teaching her students to see each other and themselves with kindness, respect, and courage. And in doing so, she was learning those lessons all over again. Triumph beyond the classroom. The buzz from Daniel's recognition at the assembly didn't fade easily. Over the weekend, parents, teachers, and even students from other classes talked about the moment he had rolled across the stage, his smile bright enough to light up the auditorium. For Daniel, it was validation. For Maggie Adams, it was a reminder that small steps could lead to profound changes. But not everyone was as thrilled. On Monday morning, Principal Wilson called Maggie into his office. "Maggie," he began, his tone careful, "I just had a meeting with Travis's parents." Maggie's heart sank. "And they're concerned," Wilson said, folding his hands on the desk. "They feel the focus on inclusivity is putting unnecessary pressure on Travis to set an example, as they put it." Maggie frowned. "But Travis is thriving. He's participating more, he's showing leadership skills, and he's even helping Daniel. That's growth, isn't it? Wilson nodded. It is. But their concern isn't about Travis's performance. It's about the social dynamics. They're worried he's being pushed into roles he doesn't feel ready for. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. What do you suggest I do? I don't want you to undo the progress you've made, Wilson said, but maybe find ways to highlight every student's strengths so no one feels singled out. Maggie nodded slowly. It wasn't an unreasonable request, but it felt like a step backward after all the strides her class had made. Still, she was determined to find a way to keep the momentum going. That afternoon, Maggie addressed her class. "We've been working hard to build a strong community in here," she said, her voice warm. "And I think it's time to celebrate all of you." The students exchanged curious glances. "We're going to create a classroom showcase," Maggie explained. "Each of you will have a chance to share something you're proud of, whether it's a skill, a talent, or a project you've worked on. This is your chance to shine." The room buzzed with excitement as the students began brainstorming ideas. Mia wanted to perform a piano piece, Jacob planned to show off his science project, and Travis decided to demonstrate his basketball skills. When Maggie turned to Daniel, his face lit up with a shy smile. "I want to give a speech," he said, "about what I've learned this year." Maggie nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "That sounds perfect, Daniel." The week leading up to the showcase was a whirlwind of preparation. Maggie worked closely with each student, helping them refine their presentations. She noticed how the process brought the class even closer together. Students helped each other practice, offered encouragement, and cheered on their peers. On the day of the showcase, the classroom was transformed. Desks were pushed aside to create a small stage, and decorations hung from the walls. Parents and teachers filled the room, their faces glowing with anticipation. The event began with Mia's piano performance, followed by Jacob's science experiment, which earned loud applause. Travis wowed the audience with his basketball tricks, bouncing the ball expertly before landing a perfect shot into a makeshift hoop. Maggie smiled as his parents clapped enthusiastically, their earlier concerns seemingly forgotten. Finally, it was Daniel's turn. He wheeled himself to the front of the room, his certificate from the assembly pinned proudly to his chest. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady. "I want to talk about what this year has meant to me." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "At the start of the year, I didn't feel like I belonged here. I thought my wheelchair made me different in a bad way. But then something changed. My classmates started seeing me, not just the chair, and I started seeing myself differently too." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes as Daniel continued. "Miss Adams taught me that being different doesn't mean being less, and my classmates taught me that kindness and teamwork can make anything possible." He smiled, his voice filled with pride. "I'm not just Daniel in the wheelchair. I'm Daniel, your classmate, your friend, and I'm proud to be part of this class." The room erupted into applause, and Daniel beamed, his confidence shining brighter than ever. Maggie glanced at Travis's parents and saw them clapping enthusiastically, their faces filled with admiration. After the showcase, parents approached Maggie, their words of praise pouring out. "You've done something incredible with these kids," one mother said. "They're not just learning, they're growing." Travis's parents approached next. His mother hesitated before speaking. "Miss Adams, we owe you an apology. We were worried about Travis, but seeing him today, we realize you've helped him grow in ways we couldn't have imagined. Thank you." Maggie felt a wave of relief. "It's been a team effort," she said. "The kids have taught me just as much as I taught them." As the room emptied and the decorations were taken down, Maggie sat at her desk, reflecting on the journey. The year had been one of the most challenging of her career, but it had also been the most rewarding. She had doubted herself, faced criticism, and made mistakes. But through it all, she had chosen to listen, adapt, and grow. And in doing so, She had witnessed the incredible resilience and potential of her students. That night, as Maggie prepared for bed, she received a text message from Daniel's mother. "Miss Adams, thank you for believing in Daniel. Today, he told me he wants to be a teacher when he grows up, just like you. You've changed his life, and will always be grateful." Maggie set the phone down, her heart full. She had entered this profession to make a difference, and now she knew she had. Because teaching wasn't just about academics. It was about helping children find their voices, their strength, and their place in the world. And for Maggie Adams, there was no greater triumph than that.